The first day we arrived at the lake cabin felt like a dream come true. After years of city noise, endless traffic, and neighbors stacked on top of each other like sardines in an apartment building, stepping onto that wide-open porch overlooking the water felt like freedom itself. The smell of pine trees mixed with fresh lake air hit us the second we stepped out of the truck. My wife stretched her arms wide, taking it all in, and said, "This is it. This is home." I couldn't agree more. We had been saving for years to buy a place that wasn't tied down by neighborhood associations, complicated rules, or power-hungry boards. All we wanted was peace. The very next morning, though, that peace was tested. My wife stepped outside to grab the morning paper and found something odd wedged under our doormat. It was a stack of papers, all stamped with bold letters. Across the top of the first page it read, "Mandatory HOA membership, immediate action required." She carried it inside, flipping through the pages, and shook her head in disbelief. "What is this nonsense? We don't live in an HOA, right?" she asked. I took the papers from her, scanned through the legal-looking nonsense, and laughed. "No, we're not in their HOA. This is just scare tactics. I bought this property outside of their jurisdiction for a reason." That was the moment I realized we weren't just buying a peaceful retreat. We were buying our way into a neighborhood war. The next-door neighbors had already warned us about someone named Karen, the so-called queen of the HOA. She ran their meetings like a dictator, imposed outrageous fines on families for ridiculous reasons, and had even screamed at kids for riding bikes too fast on sidewalks. She was the type who thrived on control, who got a sense of power by bossing people around. And she had set her sights on us. Later that afternoon, as I was unloading boxes from the truck, I heard sharp footsteps coming up the porch steps. Without so much as a knock, there she was. Karen stood in front of me, arms crossed, lips pressed tight like she had just bitten into a lemon. She wore a bright floral blouse and had a clipboard tucked under one arm. Without even greeting me, she announced, "Excuse me, you'll need to sign these papers. You are required to join our HOA immediately. Everyone here follows the rules." My wife walked out from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel, and raised an eyebrow. "I don't think so," she said calmly. "Our deed is clean. We're not under your HOA, and we don't intend to be." Karen's eyes narrowed. She glanced at her clipboard, flipped through her papers, and smirked. "All properties in this area are required to comply. If you don't join, you'll be fined." That was when I stepped in. "Listen carefully," I said firmly. "I bought this property specifically because it's not in your HOA. I know my boundaries. I know my rights. You have no authority here." For a moment, her face twisted with pure frustration. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "We'll see about that." And just like that, she spun around and stomped down the porch steps, muttering under her breath. My wife shook her head, letting out a small laugh. "Wow, she really thinks she owns the whole neighborhood, doesn't she?" I shrugged, trying to brush it off. But deep down, I had a sinking feeling. People like Karen didn't back down easily. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. First, she started sending more letters. Bright orange envelopes marked urgent showed up in our mailbox almost every morning. Inside were fake invoices claiming we owed hundreds of dollars in overdue HOA fees. My wife tore them up without even reading past the first line. "Straight to the trash," she said, tossing them into the bin with a satisfied flick. Then came the notices posted on our property. One morning, we found a laminated paper nailed to our gate, accusing us of unauthorized landscaping. Another day, a note claiming our mailbox was non-compliant with community standards. It was ridiculous. None of it applied to us. Still, Karen persisted like a wasp you couldn't swat away. One evening, I caught her standing at the edge of our driveway, taking pictures of our house with her phone. My wife marched straight outside, hands on her hips, and called out, "Can I help you with something?" Karen looked startled but quickly regained her smug expression. "Just documenting violations," she replied. "Violations of what?" "We're not in your HOA. Stop trespassing on our property." Karen's smirk faltered, but she tried to hold her ground. "You'll regret this," she snapped before storming off. "I'll be honest. Part of me thought about installing cameras right then and there. But my wife, as calm and steady as she always is, just patted my arm and said, 'She's bluffing. Don't let her rattle you.'" What my wife didn't know was that Karen wasn't bluffing at all. She had one more move planned. And when it came, it would drag the county sheriff straight to our doorstep. The night it happened, we were sitting on the porch enjoying the sunset. The lake shimmered in shades of gold and orange, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful again. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Karen pacing in her driveway, phone pressed tightly to her ear. She was waving her arms wildly, pointing toward our house, and looking angrier than ever. My wife leaned over and whispered, "She's calling someone." I didn't even have to guess who. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, we heard it, the low wail of sirens in the distance. The sound grew louder until finally, a sheriff's vehicle pulled up in front of our cabin. Karen rushed forward like a kid who couldn't wait to tattle to the teacher. She pointed toward us, shouting, "There. That's them. They're refusing to comply with HOA regulations. They're breaking the law." I stood from the porch, heart pounding, ready to defend our rights. My wife stayed seated, calm as ever, watching the officer step out of his car. But what happened next was something neither of us, or Karen, could have predicted. Karen's shrill voice echoed across the yard as the sheriff stepped out of his vehicle. She was pointing at our cabin like it was a crime scene, her clipboard clutched against her chest as if it were a badge of authority. "Officer! Officer!" she shouted, rushing to him. "They are refusing to follow the HOA bylaws. They've ignored fines, ignored notices, and they are deliberately breaking the law. You have to arrest them." Her face was red, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and self-righteousness. The sheriff adjusted his hat, calm and collected, and looked past her toward me. I stood on the porch steps, watching silently, while my wife remained seated in her chair, calm as stone, almost amused by the spectacle. I could tell she wasn't afraid. She had that unshakable confidence about her that I'd seen many times before. But me? I'll admit my stomach was tight. I had never dealt with police showing up at my front door because of a neighbor's nonsense. Karen, meanwhile, wouldn't stop ranting. "They've been openly defying us. They put up that mailbox without approval. They have landscaping that doesn't meet standards. And they haven't paid a single HOA fee, not one. I demand that you cite them immediately." The sheriff didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced at her clipboard, then slowly looked back at our cabin. He walked toward us without saying a word to her, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Karen hurried after him, still spewing accusations. "Don't let them lie to you. They're sneaky. They think they're above the rules, but nobody is above my HOA." I couldn't help but exchange a look with my wife. She raised an eyebrow, and for a split second, I thought she might actually burst out laughing at the ridiculousness of it all. But she stayed composed, leaning back in her chair like she was waiting for a show to begin. The sheriff stopped at the bottom of our porch steps, looked directly at my wife, and then he did something that made my jaw drop. He straightened his posture, lifted his hand to his forehead, and gave her a sharp, respectful salute. Karen's mouth fell open. What are you doing?" she stammered, stepping forward as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The sheriff held the salute for a moment longer, then lowered his hand and spoke directly to my wife. "Ma'am," he said with a tone of genuine respect, "I didn't expect to find you out here. It's an honor. Karen's face turned crimson. Honor? She's breaking the law. She's refusing to join the HOA. The sheriff finally turned to face her, and his expression hardened. First of all, ma'am, HOA regulations are not criminal law. They're civil agreements between homeowners and the association. This property, he gestured toward our cabin, is not within your HOA's jurisdiction. I've already looked at the county records. Their deed is completely clean. They are not, and never were, part of your association. Karen's eyes widened. She shook her head violently, gripping her clipboard like it was her lifeline. That's impossible. Everyone here is under the HOA. Everyone. My wife finally stood, slow and deliberate. She walked to the porch railing, leaned on it, and looked down at Karen. Her voice was calm, almost kind, but firm. Not us. We chose this property because it's outside your reach. We're not signing your papers, we're not paying your fees, and we're certainly not living under your control. Karen started to shout again, but the sheriff raised a hand to silence her. His patience was clearly wearing thin. Ma'am, you need to understand something. Harassing your neighbors, trespassing on their property, and making false claims to law enforcement is serious. If you continue this behavior, you're the one who's going to find herself in legal trouble. That shut her up for a moment, but her face twisted with frustration. She sputtered, You can't be serious. I was trying to enforce the rules. I was protecting the community. The sheriff's gaze hardened even more. Protecting the community doesn't mean bullying people who aren't under your authority. It doesn't mean fabricating violations or calling deputies out here for no reason. You've wasted county resources tonight. If I get another call like this, you won't just be embarrassed, you'll be cited for harassment. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Her whole face twitched with barely contained rage. The sheriff turned back to my wife, and his voice softened. Ma'am, again, it's an honor. I remember seeing you at the state ceremony a few years back. The county recognizes what you've done for this country, and you don't deserve to be harassed at your own home. It was then that the truth clicked for me, why he had saluted her. My wife wasn't just another homeowner. She was a decorated veteran, someone who had served overseas with distinction, someone whose name carried weight in this county. She never bragged about it, never brought it up, but the sheriff remembered. Karen, however, didn't care. She let out a bitter laugh. So what, she's a veteran? That doesn't mean she can ignore the HOA. The sheriff snapped his head toward her, his patience completely gone. It means you will show her respect. And it means this conversation is over. With that, he tipped his hat to my wife once more and started back toward his vehicle. Karen trailed after him, sputtering half-finished sentences, trying to salvage her crumbling authority. But, she's... The sheriff climbed into his car, started the engine, and rolled down the window just long enough to deliver his final words, "Stay off their property, ma'am. This is your only warning." And with that, he drove away, leaving Karen standing in the road, fuming like a kettle about to boil over. I turned to my wife, who was already settling back into her chair, completely unfazed. She gave me a small smile and said, "Told you she couldn't touch us." I let out a laugh I'd been holding in for what felt like hours. The tension drained from my shoulders, replaced by a mix of pride and relief. Karen had thrown everything she had at us, letters, threats, fake fines, even the police. And in the end, she lost in the most humiliating way possible, standing in the street, powerless, while a county sheriff saluted the very woman she tried to bully. That night, as the crickets sang and the lake reflected the moonlight, I realized something important. Karen thought control was power. She thought she could push people around with rules and fines and intimidation. But real power? Real power was earned. And my wife had earned it in ways Karen could never even understand. And though Karen didn't know it yet, her downfall had only just begun. Karen didn't take that night's humiliation quietly. If anything, it only fueled her obsession. The morning after the sheriff left, she was out in her yard before sunrise, stomping around with her phone glued to her ear. My wife and I sat on the porch drinking coffee, watching her pace like a general plotting her next battle. She kept pointing at our cabin, snapping pictures, and scribbling notes on her clipboard. Every time she looked our way, her glare could have cut glass. But to my wife, it was nothing more than background noise. She sipped her coffee calmly, as if Karen didn't exist at all. That calmness drove Karen insane. She wanted a reaction, wanted us to show fear, but she wasn't going to get it. The problem with people like her is that when they can't control you, they spiral. By midday, she had already typed up another letter and taped it to our mailbox, this one claiming she was reporting us to the county zoning board. My wife laughed when she tore it down. Let her waste her time. They'll ignore her the same way the sheriff did. But Karen didn't just waste her time, she started wasting everyone's. She marched door to door, trying to rally other neighbors against us. Some of them nodded politely, but most of them just looked annoyed. A few even came by later to quietly warn us about her antics. One man told us, "She's been a nightmare for years. She fined my kids for leaving their bikes in the driveway. She fined my wife for planting roses that weren't on her approved list. We all hate it, but she never had the guts to go this far before. You two stood up to her, and now she's unraveling." That was when we realized the truth. Karen's power had never been real. It only existed because everyone else let her get away with it. And now that she had been publicly embarrassed, cracks were beginning to show in her little empire. Still, that didn't mean she stopped coming after us. 2 days later, I came home to find her standing in our driveway, holding a tape measure. She was bent over, measuring the width of our gate. I got out of the truck and walked up to her. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't even flinch. "Checking for violations," she said without looking up. "Your gate doesn't meet the community standards. It must be at least." I cut her off. "This isn't your community. You're trespassing again. Get off my property." She finally straightened up, clutching her clipboard like a weapon. "You think you're so untouchable just because that sheriff saluted your wife? That doesn't change the fact that you're in violation of HOA rules. You can't hide behind her forever." My blood boiled, but before I could say a word, my wife stepped out onto the porch. She didn't raise her voice, didn't show any anger. She simply said, "Karen, I've faced men with rifles pointed at me. Do you honestly think your clipboard scares me?" For the first time, I saw Karen hesitate. Her face twitched, her mouth opened and closed like she wanted to snap back, but the words never came. Instead, she turned sharply on her heel and stormed away, muttering under her breath. That small exchange shifted something in the neighborhood. Word spread quickly, people started talking about how Karen had been shut down by both the sheriff and my wife. Neighbors who had kept their heads down for years began standing up a little straighter. Some even stopped by to shake my wife's hand, thanking her for what she had done. One elderly couple told us, "She's been terrorizing us for years. Seeing her finally get told off, it's like watching the sun rise after a storm." But Karen wasn't finished. If anything, her desperation grew. She tried filing complaints with the county, but they were all dismissed. She tried organizing an emergency HOA meeting to vote us in against our will, but the lawyer she consulted shut her down. Our property simply wasn't under their jurisdiction. The more she failed, the angrier she became. Then came her boldest move yet. One afternoon, while we were out running errands, she snuck onto our property and taped massive neon signs to our fence. They said things like, "Non-compliant homeowners," and "HOA delinquents." When we pulled up the driveway and saw them flapping in the wind, my wife just shook her head, peeled one down, and said, "This is the behavior of a child who's losing control." I was furious, ready to march over and confront her again. But my wife stopped me. "Let her dig her own hole," she said. "The sheriff warned her once. Next time, she'll pay for it." Sure enough, the next time came quicker than we expected. The very next morning, Karen was back in our yard, yelling about how we were corrupting the neighborhood and setting a bad example. She had crossed the line again, and this time, another neighbor called the sheriff, not us. When the deputy arrived, he didn't waste a second. He walked straight up to Karen and said, "Ma'am, you were warned. Step off this property now or you'll be cited for trespassing." Karen turned bright red. "But they—" "No buts," the deputy interrupted. "The law is clear. They're not in your HOA. If you set foot here again without their permission, you'll be arrested. Do you understand?" Karen sputtered, looked around at the small group of neighbors who had gathered to watch, and then, in the most humiliating moment of all, she had to march away empty-handed, her clipboard bouncing at her side. The neighbors actually started clapping as she left. I'll never forget the look on my wife's face in that moment. She wasn't gloating, wasn't smug. She just smiled softly, nodded at the deputy, and went back to watering her plants as if nothing had happened. She didn't need to say a word. Her calm strength had said it all. From that day forward, Karen's hold over the neighborhood crumbled. People stopped attending her meetings. Families who had been silent for years suddenly found their voices, pushing back against her ridiculous rules. The very power she had spent years building slipped through her fingers, all because she picked a fight she couldn't win. And as for us, life slowly returned to peace. The sheriff's salute had done more than protect us, it had exposed Karen for what she really was. And the more she tried to fight back, the more foolish she looked in front of everyone. What Karen didn't realize was that this wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. It was about respect. And respect is something you can't demand, can't fine people into giving, can't enforce with threats or clipboards. It has to be earned. My wife had earned it years ago, long before we ever moved to that cabin. And now, everyone around us was beginning to see it too. By the time the sun set that evening, neighbors we barely knew were stopping by to introduce themselves, bringing pies, casseroles, and even small gifts. They weren't just welcoming us, they were showing appreciation for standing up to the person who had been making their lives miserable for so long. For the first time since moving in, I felt like this cabin wasn't just our escape, it was home. And somewhere across the street, Karen sat in her house, blinds drawn, watching as the neighborhood slowly slipped out of her control. The weeks that followed felt like watching the seasons change. Karen had gone from marching around the neighborhood with her clipboard like a queen, barking orders and scaring families, to sitting behind her curtains, peeking through the blinds while the world carried on without her. It was strange how quickly her power crumbled once people realized she wasn't untouchable. For years, the neighbors had been too afraid to stand up to her. They paid her ridiculous fines, followed her absurd rules, and avoided conflict just to keep the peace. But after the sheriff saluted my wife on our porch, the illusion was shattered. Karen wasn't an authority figure, she was just a bully who thrived on intimidation. And when bullies get exposed, their grip slips fast. One by one, neighbors started to break free from her hold. The Petersons, who had once been fined for painting their shutters the wrong shade of blue, stopped attending HOA meetings. The Johnsons, who had been forced to cut down their backyard tree because Karen claimed it was unsightly, openly refused to pay any more dues. The Thompsons, a sweet retired couple, started telling anyone who would listen how Karen had fined them for leaving a ladder against their garage for 2 hours. The stories piled up, and soon everyone realized they weren't alone. They had all been suffering in silence, thinking they were the only ones. Now, united, they weren't afraid anymore. And my wife? She became something of a local hero without even trying. Neighbors would wave when she walked by, kids would run up to her, and even the grumpiest old-timers on the block would tip their hats in respect. People stopped by with pies, cookies, and thank you notes. One family even dropped off a handmade wooden plaque that said, "Real freedom lives here." It was humbling, but my wife never acted like she was owed any of it. She'd just smile, shake their hands, and say, "I just stood my ground." That's all. Karen, on the other hand, grew more bitter with every passing day. She sent out angry HOA newsletters, accusing us of being troublemakers and outsiders who didn't care about the community. She tried to convince people that without her leadership, the neighborhood would fall into chaos. But the problem was, her words carried no weight anymore. People had seen the truth with their own eyes. They had seen the sheriff shut her down, seen her stomp off our property in defeat, seen her power evaporate like mist in the sun. One afternoon, I was repairing a loose board on our dock when our neighbor, Mr. Peterson, walked over. He leaned on the railing, chuckling, and said, "You know, I've lived here 20 years. I've watched Karen bully this entire neighborhood. Never thought I'd see the day she got put in her place. You two did more in a month than the rest of us managed in 2 decades." I laughed, shaking my head. All we did was refuse to let her walk over us. "That's all it takes sometimes," he said with a grin. One person standing up. It struck me then how much fear had fueled Karen's reign. She didn't have real authority, just a clipboard, a loud voice, and the ability to scare people into believing she had power. And fear only works if people believe it. But here's the thing about fear, once someone breaks it, everyone else starts to see through the cracks. Of course, Karen didn't go down quietly. She tried one last desperate move. A month after the sheriff's visit, we got a letter in the mail, this time not from the HOA, but from a lawyer. It claimed we were in violation of community agreements and that legal action would be taken if we didn't comply. My wife read the letter, then handed it to me with a little smile. "She's really reaching now, isn't she?" I called the lawyer's office the next morning. Within minutes, they confirmed exactly what we suspected. Karen had hired them, but when they looked at our deed and property lines, they immediately realized she had no case. They dropped her as a client the same week. That was the final nail in the coffin. With no legal ground to stand on, no sheriff willing to back her, and no neighbors left to support her, Karen's reign collapsed completely. By the end of the summer, the HOA she once ruled with an iron fist was in shambles. People stopped paying dues, stopped following her endless rules, and eventually demanded she step down as president. She fought it, of course, screaming about loyalty and respect, but nobody cared anymore. Without fear, she was nothing more than a cranky neighbor with too much time on her hands. And us? We finally got the peace we came for. The lake cabin became everything we dreamed it would be. Mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons fishing off the dock, evenings watching the sun melt into the water. Neighbors would drop by not with complaints or fines, but with invitations to barbecues and bonfires. The community, once ruled by tension and fear, slowly turned into what it should have been all along, a place where people actually enjoyed living. One night, as my wife and I sat by the fire pit, listening to the crickets and the gentle lap of water against the shore, I asked her, "Do you ever regret moving here? All the chaos with Karen, did it ever make you wish we'd gone somewhere else?" She stared into the fire for a long moment, then shook her head. "Not for a second. Freedom is never free, you always have to defend it, even in small ways. If Karen hadn't tested us, maybe we wouldn't have realized how strong this community could be once people stood together. She tried to break us, but instead, she united everyone." Her words stuck with me. It was true. What started as Karen's attempt to control us ended with her undoing. And in the process, it gave our neighbors courage, gave them a voice, and gave the whole community a fresh start. As the flames crackled and sparks floated into the night sky, I looked at my wife and felt a swell of pride. She didn't just fight for us, she fought for everyone. And the sheriff's salute that night on the porch wasn't just a gesture of respect for her service. It was a symbol of something bigger, that no matter how loud or controlling someone tries to be, truth and honor will always stand taller. From that day on, whenever I looked at Karen's darkened windows across the street, I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt pity. She had built her identity around control, and when she lost it, she had nothing left. Meanwhile, my wife and I had built something real: respect, community, and peace. And as the lake shimmered under the moonlight, I realized we hadn't just bought a cabin. We had claimed a life worth living, free from the grip of people like her. And Karen? Well, she never knocked on our door again.